Hi, I'm Corey. I'm going to be presenting for a class that I have on Romans at Moody Bible Institute online. And I'm going to be talking about the new perspective um, on Paul. If you haven't heard about that, that's okay. I'll explain it. Um, let's dive into it. Why did I pick this topic? Most of my class was on this topic, interacted heavily with this topic. It is the latest thing in biblical scholarship out there, which, when I say that, I mean in biblical scholarship in a very secular way, which is kind of uh, ironic. It doesn't seem very scholarly or very biblical to me, but that's the trend of thought out there with those higher academics over at Oxford and Cambridge and England and Princeton and I can't think of another really Union Theological Seminary, probably another liberal seminary here in America. Um, it's the latest thing on Paul. It's the latest. It's kind of lost some momentum. But let me explain to you basically what it is before I get any further into it. The new perspective came about with E.P. Sanders in the 70s, and basically what it's saying is that we've misunderstood, the church has misunderstood the cultural background against which Romans and Galatians and just generally all of the New Testament, but specifically focus on Romans, is given. We misunderstand first century Judaism. How we think of first century Judaism traditionally as this works based religion is incorrect. Um, they don't really cite a whole lot of sources. They just point out that the sources that generally are cited for this, which would be like the Mishnah or the Tanakh. I'm sorry, not the Tanakh. The Mishnah is one of them. The Hebrew commentary, the Jewish commentaries later, which are written in like the 4th century. They say those are written too late and stuff. But basically that's what it is. It's saying you understand it wrong. It wasn't a works-based religion. They had a grace-based system too. They believed that they were saved through God's covenants, and that they just maintained it by works. Real basic definition of the new perspective. Initially, that sounds fine. That does not sound too bad. You go, okay, that's a little bit different. Let's sit down and listen to that. We misunderstood the cultural background. What are your evidences for that? And let's look at them and let's sit down. Okay, that sounds fine. That doesn't sound to be a particularly bad thing or really that revolutionary. But it's been taken a lot farther than that. Let me give you some basic tenets of the new perspective to show you exactly what it's to be taken to. 1, Augustine and Luther read their own personal struggle with sin and God's judgment into the text of Paul, particularly Romans. That would be one of their major tenets. Is they're saying that this whole idea that there's this struggle with sin going on in Paul's writings in Romans, that Paul is trying to understand, how does a sinful man stand before a holy God, and combating this works-based penance system is all Lutheran. And I don't know at what point they took it back to Augustine, but they had to take it back to Augustine because they were really struggling. Augustine is like almost 1,000 years before Luther, because he also used it this way. But they're basically saying that those guys are the major contributors to this view, and that's where the church got it from. It really wasn't from Romans. 2, first century Jews did not have a works-based idea of salvation. Rather, they thought of being saved by God's grace administered to them in the covenants. That's something I already touched on. That's really those are really the most basic tenets. We'll get into some of the other things. 3, first century Christians did not have such an individualistic mentality about their relationship with God. I just stop here real quick and say some of this stuff is kind of true, and that's what makes it so dangerous. The old saying, a good lie is only 1 degree away from the truth. A good lie contains as much truth as possible. It's always a mixture. This is kind of true. Let me point this out. I think it's errorous of us to think of any culture at any period of time having one set of beliefs. It is true that if you look at older cultures, they weren't as fast-paced as ours. The technology boom, ever since the Industrial Revolution, things have been really fast-paced in the West. But if you go back further than that, you have agricultural societies. They really stay static. People don't really move. very far from where they live. There's not this mass exchange of ideas. But even in that situation, not everybody believes the same thing about everything. And so to ever assume when you're reading the Bible that all the Jews in Jerusalem believe the same thing about this, we know that's not true. We already know that's not true. In the Bible, it mentions 3 different sects of Judaism. You have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Zealots mentioned. And we're also aware of the Essenes, which some people believe John the Baptist was, but they were the ones who kept the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. So we're already aware that there was a massive different amount of thought out there. And to some extent, do I think that some Jews thought that salvation was by grace through faith and that they believe that? Yeah, that makes sense. That may be what Jesus meant when he says to Nathanael, behold, a true Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. So that could very well be. And I don't think we should look at any group of people throughout history and say, oh, they all believed this about this. There's some people today who believe some really whacked out things about aliens and conspiracies and stuff, and maybe some of that's true, maybe it's not, but the point is that you're not going to find a single people group where they're unified in all their beliefs, and so it's an error on either side to assume that everybody believed this. And so from that perspective, any perspective that kind of goes, hey, you guys, you're all thinking of this one way, and really these people could have been believing a bunch of different things, is good. But that's not really what the new perspective does. It actually just kind of switches and says, no, you're totally wrong, and this is the way to look at it. So anyway, continuing 4, and this is pretty doctrinal, but it's saying that the concept of imputed righteousness, which is basically God legally declares you righteous in like a legal courtroom, is not from Paul, but really from Luther. That is very, very lofty statement. Now you're really starting to get into where this is starting to really erode at Orthodox theology now. Imputed righteousness is a huge, long-standing Christian doctrine. And it's very important when you're talking about salvation. This is really the heart of understanding the gospel. And so you start to see some of the seriousness of the claims of the new perspective. 5th, Paul actually taught perfectionism, would be another thing. They would look at passages where Paul says, like, as to the law, I was blameless, and say that Paul is not against works and being perfect. He actually is encouraging it. And, this church Christian concept that says, salvation is by grace just encourages people to be lazy, sloppy Christians, and that does happen. I think people take license from that, but that's not the point of it at all. And I don't think that Paul taught perfectionism. 6, and the final one I'm going to focus on, is the issue that Paul is addressing with Jews is the rejection of Jesus as Messiah. And they're excluding Gentiles from the covenant community of faith, not good works versus grace, imputed righteousness received by faith. So that's also another big issue that I've already kind of touched on. I do want to say at this point, now that I've kind of given this overview, this isn't a scholarly overview. If you want something more scholarly, D.A. Carson has a lecture. If you just go D.A. Carson, New Perspective Lecture, and Google that, it'll come up. Also, one of the books I had to read for class, which is very scholarly, pretty easy to read considering what it's tackling, is The Perspectives on Paul, Old and New, The Lutheran Paul and His Critics by Stephen Westerholm. I do recommend it. I did not read the entire thing. We just had to read excerpts, but it was very good read. Would recommend it if you want to get into a scholarly thing. I'm just going to kind of give you a thought-by-thought, basic layman's overview of it. If you want cited sources and all that stuff, again, D.A. Carson or Westerholm here with his work. So that's kind of what the new perspective is, and why I'm tackling this issue. I think it will be more prevalent in the churches in the years to come. I think it could be. I hope it's not. It might be dead. It might not. I know when I was taking this class, I saw a commentary series by N.T. Wright for sale at CBD. So maybe somebody buys that. You start to hear about this in the church. Maybe this video helps you. That would be cool. Anyway, continuing with my explanation of it here. So what's the biblical perspective? All right, we got this. We have the old perspective, which is, okay, Paul is, teaching grace versus works in Romans. That's what Romans is all about. It's all about, everybody being under sin and needing grace, and grace being the means for salvation, and that's through Christ's sacrifice on the cross, but you're saved by grace through faith in Christ, kind of a thing. That's really been the traditional way of looking at Romans, and for many, many centuries in Christianity, and the New Perspective is challenging that, saying, no, you're misunderstanding it. You're assuming these Jews were works-based. They're not. That's not what Paul's fighting. What he's really arguing about is, Jesus being the Messiah and including them in the covenant community, because their whole idea of covenant community, and they're just talking about works as a maintaining factor for their relationship with God, not as the starting factor or the for their relationship with God. So that's kind of the old versus new thing there. But what's the biblical perspective? Well, what really does the Bible say about this issue? And I think that the best place to go for that I could think of in Romans was Romans 3:20 through 25. I'll read that to you real quick, and maybe if I do some good video editing, I'll have it available up for you to read along with me as I go through it. I'll be reading out of the English Standard Version. For by works of the law no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. But now the righteousness of God has been manifest apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. So, to me, this pretty much seals it. I really struggle to see this whole New Perspective, to say there's not a grace versus works thing going on here in the text. But let's really look at this text. Let's really unpack this text and see what's going on. Notice it starts out with the phrase, for by works of the law. Here Paul is opening up with this phrase, works of the law. And this is one of the areas where the New Perspective tries to attack on a scholarly level and say, oh no, law, nomos, doesn't really mean this. I find that troubling. I even found some stuff by Josephus that law is pretty much referring to the religious guidelines that the Jews held that kept in accordance with the New Testament, and Josephus is like right first century, late half of first century. So I mean, like, it's very difficult for me to believe an argument where you could say, here's me 2,000 years removed, and I know something better about history than somebody who's 50 years removed from the situation, from the event. It's kind of like that game Telephone. And it's really ridiculous. And in fact, a lot of, in my opinion, arrogant modern scholars do this all the time, and say, well, I think, I don't think Jesus said this because of this, and it's in the Gospel of John. And I'm like, there's no way you know better today what Jesus said 2,000 years ago than the people that hung out with him. And it's kind of the same thing about the New Perspective. But anyway, after a long word study on this works of the law phrase, let me see if I can pull up my definition quickly here. I'll come up with my conclusion, and I consulted the Kittel, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, probably my most scholarly source, and really looked at what that had to say about it. These words together comprise the phrase works of the law, or argon namu. This phrase, that's in Greek. This phrase is only used by Paul and only in his letter to the Romans and Galatians. In context, Paul uses this phrase to mean, and this is my definition after a lot of research, deeds that conform to the moral standard God requires as revealed in the Mosaic Law. So when Paul's talking about works of the law in Romans, what he is talking about is doing good works that are in accordance with basically the Ten Commandments. In that guideline, I think that one rabbi has it down to 400 and some with the entire Torah, the entire Mosaic Law. But that's what it's saying, and that's a good thing. Paul isn't knocking doing those things. per se.